There is a self-storage facility on the edge of a cold Ohio city. 500 identical orange doors in long, fluorescent-lit rows, and behind one of them, a 68-year-old Marine named Sam Rourke lived for 3 winters without a single person in that building ever knowing he was there. He paid for the unit like any other customer. He came and went like any other customer. And every night, behind a wall of stacked cardboard boxes that looked exactly like everyone else's forgotten belongings, he was home. That is not a story about a man who gave up. It is a story about a man who understood something the rest of us never have to learn and used it to stay alive and to keep a promise. The world had stopped seeing Sam Rourke years before he ever moved into that unit. He simply decided that being unseen was no longer going to kill him. It was going to save him. What he built behind that orange door would keep him warmer than the apartment he had lost. And it would keep something else too, something he had carried for 40 years. But there was one morning, in the dead of the 3rd winter, when the whole hidden life he had built came within one cut padlock of ending forever. Hold on to that. We will get there. Because to understand why a decorated Marine chose to live behind a wall of boxes in a storage locker, you first have to understand what was in those boxes. And what he did in that unit is something almost nobody alive would ever think to do. Sam Rourke had not always been invisible. There was a time the Marine Corps saw him very clearly. He enlisted at 18, a big quiet kid from a mill town, and by 25 he was a corporal with the Marines sent to keep the peace in Beirut. He was there on the morning of October 23, 1983, when a truck full of explosives came through the gate of the barracks and took 241 American servicemen in a matter of seconds, the worst single-day loss the Corps had suffered since Iwo Jima. Sam Rourke walked out of that. A great many of the men he had eaten breakfast with did not. He never talked about the details, but the details never once left him. The particular Sunday morning quiet before the truck came through the wire. The blast that was not so much a sound as a pressure that took the air out of the whole world at once. And the days after, digging, and what digging for your own friends does to a man at 25. Sam carried all of it home, folded up small and put away, the way the Corps had taught him to carry everything heavy, and he told exactly no one, for 40 years, because the men who would have understood were mostly gone, and the men who weren't simply couldn't. He came home in one piece, on the outside, and he did the thing that generation of men did, which was to say nothing, and carry it alone, and build a life on top of it. He drove a forklift at a distribution warehouse for 31 years. He married a woman named Elaine. They rented the same second-floor apartment for most of their lives, nothing fancy, but theirs. And in a rented storage unit across town, Sam kept the one thing he could never bring himself to throw away or fully open. The footlockers and boxes of the men who had not walked out of Beirut, effects that had drifted to him over the decades, letters and photographs and dog tags and a folded flag, the belongings of the dead that nobody else had wanted to keep. Somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to, Sam Rourke had become their keeper. It had happened slowly, the way these things do. A mother in Ohio who could not bear to keep her son's footlocker and could not bear to throw it out, who had heard that Rourke was steady and mailed it to him with a short note. A widow who pressed a folded flag into his hands at a reunion and said, "You were there, you keep it." A box that arrived once with no return address at all, just a name he knew written on the side and a hand he did not. One by one, across 30 years, the belongings of the men who had not walked out of that barracks found their way to the one man who refused to let them be forgotten, until a rented 10 by 15 room in Ohio held more of those 8 lives than any place left on earth. He never once counted it a burden. He counted it the last order he had ever been given, even though no living person had ever actually given it to him. The unraveling came the way it comes for so many old men, quietly, one subtraction at a time. The warehouse automated and let the older men go. Elaine's cancer moved fast, and the bills moved faster and outlived her by years. The pension did not stretch the way the arithmetic needed it to. The rent on the second-floor apartment climbed the way rent climbs, and one autumn Sam Rourke did the math at the kitchen table, alone, and understood that he could keep the apartment or he could keep paying for the storage unit that held his brothers, but not both. He sat with that arithmetic a long time. He thought about Elaine, who had understood about the unit without ever being told much, who had never once asked him to give it up, who had married a quiet man and made her peace with the parts of him that had stayed behind in Beirut. He thought about the 8 names, and he understood, sitting alone at that kitchen table, that a man is finally just the sum of the promises he refuses to break. The apartment was only an apartment. The unit was a grave he had appointed himself to guard. He was 65 years old, a Marine, a widower, and he did not hesitate for 1 second. He gave up the apartment. He could have found a warmer road, maybe, in time. A shelter bed on the worst nights. A car, like other men. But every one of those roads led away from that 10 by 15 room, and that room was the only place on earth his brothers still were. So the choice was never really a choice at all. Wherever the dead were kept, that was where the last of them would stand his watch. He had spent his whole life learning the one thing the Corps never stops teaching, which is that you do not leave men behind. He was not about to start at 65. He filed for the benefits he was owed, and was told his claim was in the system, and the system was doing its best. The backlog on those claims, by many accounts, can run for months and sometimes far longer, and Sam did not have months. He had a truck that soon died, a duffel bag, and a 10 by 15 storage unit full of the dead that had just become the only thing he had left in the world. The first weeks after that were the exposed kind of homeless. The shelter cots and the cold benches and the particular danger of being an old man visible on the street every single night. And it was in the worst of that, sitting in the storage facility during the day because it was the one warm place he was allowed to be, surrounded by the boxes of men who had trusted him, that the idea arrived. It was against every rule the facility had. It was, technically, not allowed. But it was warm. It was his. It was already paid for. And it was the last place on earth that the men in those boxes still existed. Sam Rourke looked around that 10 by 15 room and understood that he was not going to abandon them to go freeze on a bench. He was going to move in. If you have ever had to protect the only thing you had left, stay with this. Subscribe if a story like this is worth a few minutes of your week. Here is what almost nobody understands about living in a storage unit, and what Sam, being Sam, worked out like a problem to be solved. The danger is not the cold, not in the kind of facility he was in. He had chosen, without quite knowing why at the time, an indoor climate-controlled building, the kind kept at a steady 55 degrees year-round to protect people's furniture from freezing. 55 degrees will not kill a man. It is the baseline of a cool room, not a frozen one, and that single fact was the foundation everything else stood on. The real dangers were 3, and he took them one at a time. Being discovered, suffocating, and going quietly out of his mind in a windowless steel box. Discovery he solved with the oldest skill the Corps ever gave him, which was concealment. He built a false wall just inside the roll-up door, a facing of stacked, labeled moving boxes, most of them real, arranged so that anyone who rolled that door up saw exactly what they expected to see, an ordinary unit packed with an old man's belongings. Behind that wall, in the back 2/3 of the unit, was everything else. He never entered or left when he could be watched. He came in the daytime like a customer with something to store, signed in at the gate with his real code, and drew no pattern anyone could ever notice. To the sleepy kid at the front desk, Sam Rourke was just a regular who came by a lot to sort through his late wife's things. That was the whole cover, and it was airtight, because it was mostly true. Suffocation he took even more seriously, because it is the mistake that kills people in sealed spaces, and he nearly made it himself, early, on one bad night. The 55 degrees was survivable, but it was not comfortable, and in that first hard week he brought in a small propane heater to take the edge off, the way a cold man does without thinking. He woke a few hours later with a skull-splitting headache and a thick, slow, sleepy wrongness in his head that a Marine who had been through gas training recognized in an instant as the beginning of the end. He got the door up and the outside air in with the last clear seconds he had, and he stood in that fluorescent hallway shaking, and he made himself a promise as serious as any he had ever made. No flame, no fuel, not ever, not once, in a room with no air of its own. From that night on, he heated the space the only safe way there was, a small electric oil-filled radiator that burned nothing and produced no bad air, run off the unit's own outlet, plus insulation, plus the trick every old hand knows, thermal mass, a couple of water jugs, and a slab of stone that soaked up the warmth and gave it back slow through the night. 55 degrees of building heat, nudged up to a safe 68 by a heater that could not hurt him, in a room he had sealed against the cold but never against the air. There were 100 smaller disciplines beneath the big ones. He hung a heavy moving blanket just inside the false wall so that no sliver of lamplight ever showed at the door's edge in the dark hallway. He learned the whole rhythm of the building, the shift changes at the front desk, the days the aisles were busy and the days they were dead, and he moved through it like a man reading terrain. He kept a real customer's clutter up front, a lamp he was supposedly selling, a chair supposedly being stored, so that even a careful eye found only what it came expecting to find. He never cooked anything that left a smell in the hall. And he kept a bag packed by the door at all hours, boots on top, because a Marine does not sleep anywhere he cannot leave in 90 seconds, and because the one thing he could not afford was to be caught flat-footed on the night the world finally noticed him. And then, because he was who he was, he built it to be a home and not a hole. He lined the back walls with the insulating panels and hung a single warm lamp. He built a real bed with real bedding, made every morning to a Marine's standard. He set a chair, a shelf, a hot plate he used only with the door cracked for air, a basin and jugs that gave him water to wash and cook and shave. And along one wall, kept with more care than anything else in the room, he arranged the footlockers and the flag and the photographs of the men from Beirut. Not stored now, not hidden in the dark, but set out the way you set out things that matter, in a warm and living room, watched over. For the first time in 40 years, the men who did not walk out of that barracks had a warm place to be, and a keeper who slept beside them every night. For 3 winters, nobody knew. Sam kept his cover with the discipline of a man whose life had twice depended on not being seen. He showered at a gym across town, spent his days at the library and the diner, and on long, warm bus rides to nowhere, ate simple, wasted nothing, and left no trace. He kept himself clean and squared away, because a tidy old man is invisible and a ragged one draws questions. To the entire world, Sam Rourke was just a quiet regular at a storage place, nobody in particular. And behind one of 500 identical doors, he was warm, he was safe, and he was not alone, because the dead keep a certain kind of company, and he had never once been able to leave them. Only one living person ever came close to knowing. There was a young man who worked the night desk that last winter, a community college kid with a grandfather in the Corps, and somewhere in those cold months he began to notice things. That Mr. Rourke's unit got an awful lot of visits for a late wife's belongings. That the old man was always clean, always alone, and somehow always there. He never said a word to management. Instead, he took to leaving the side door onto the warm hallway unlocked a little longer on the coldest nights, and once, without a word, he set a thermos of coffee and a foil-wrapped sandwich on the bench by Unit 241 and then got very busy with something else when Sam came by. Sam never acknowledged it, because acknowledging it meant being seen, and being seen was the one thing he could not afford. But he drank the coffee. And he understood that somewhere in that indifferent building, one young man had looked at a wall of boxes and quietly understood there was a whole life behind it worth keeping warm. Then, on a gray morning in the deepest cold of that third winter, the whole thing came within one cut padlock of ending. The facility had changed hands. A new management company took over, the kind that runs the numbers from an office 3 states away, and they announced a sweep, an audit of every unit flagged as behind on payment or suspected of misuse, locks to be cut and contents inspected and cleared. Sam was current on his rent to the dollar. He always had been, but the notice taped to his door that morning did not care about that. It said units would be entered and inspected for signs of unauthorized occupancy, and it named a date 3 days out, and Sam Rourke stood in that hallway at 68 years old and felt the floor tilt the way it had tilted the morning of the truck bomb, the specific vertigo of a safe world about to be taken all at once. This was the moment it was all supposed to end. An old homeless man, an illegal home, a corporate clipboard, and a winter outside with no mercy in it. Lose the unit, and he did not just lose his shelter. He lost the last warm place his brothers existed, and he became, in a single afternoon, a 70-year-old on a freezing street with a duffel bag and 40 years of the dead in his arms and nowhere on earth to put any of it. This is the part of the story where a man like Sam loses everything twice. Except Sam Rourke had built this the way a Marine builds a defensive position, which is to say, assuming it will one day be tested. When the inspectors came down, his row with their bolt cutters and their list, they rolled up the door of Unit 241 and saw precisely what a storage unit is supposed to contain. An old man's belongings, boxed and labeled and stacked, a wall of ordinary cardboard, a late wife's things, nothing out of place, nothing that broke a single rule. The false front held because it was built by a man who had learned concealment, where getting it wrong meant dying. They checked their list, found him paid in full, found nothing to flag, and pulled the door back down and moved on to the next. They never saw the second room. They never saw the bed, or the lamp, or the flag, or the 8 men from Beirut waiting quietly in the warm, dark 6 feet behind the boxes. Sam stood 2 rows over, signing in at the gate like a customer, and watched them leave, and did not let his face move at all. That night, when the building went quiet, he rolled the door down, moved the wall of boxes aside the way he did every night, and stepped into the warm room behind it. He turned on the single lamp. And there they were, kept the way he kept them, dry and warm and out of the dark at last. 8 footlockers, a folded flag, and a shelf of photographs of boys who never got to become old men. He had not saved himself that afternoon. He had saved them, again, the way he had been saving them for 40 years. He lowered himself into his chair among them, an old Marine in a warm, hidden room a corporation had walked straight past without ever knowing it was there, and for a while he did not feel invisible at all. He felt like exactly what he was, which was the last man still standing watch. The winter that came after settled the rest of it without a word from anyone. I want to be honest about what a hard freeze does to the people at the edges, because it is the part that makes what Sam built matter. When a deep cold sits on a northern city, the ones who die are not the ones you picture. They are the people in the units and the cars and the corners that were not ready. The ones who ran a flame in a sealed space to stop shivering, or had no heat at all and lost the fight 1 degree at a time a few feet from a warm building they were not allowed inside. In cold like that, across this country, people die that way every single winter, unseen, uncounted, and most of us never hear a word about it. The nights the city broke its cold records, the invisible Marine behind the orange door slept warm at 68 degrees, his safe little heater glowing, his brothers dry and warm along the wall. His whole life balanced on a discipline the Corps had given him, and the country had never once thanked him for. He was, on those nights, one of the safest and warmest people in that entire building, and not one of the 100 customers who came and went knew he was there, or that anyone was, or that behind a wall of boxes an old man was keeping a 40-year-old promise to the dead. That is the part that should sit with you. If you walked that fluorescent row tomorrow, you would see 500 identical doors and nothing else. You would not see the man, and you would not see the memorial he had built for the men his country buried and moved on from. That invisibility was his shield, and it was also the quiet indictment of all of us, because a Marine survived a truck bomb that killed 241 of his brothers, carried them for 40 years, lost his wife and his work and his home, and the one skill that finally kept him and them safe was the skill of not being seen by the country they had all served. So why does this keep happening? Why does a decorated Marine end up hiding a home behind a wall of boxes in the same country he nearly died for? The easy answer is that he fell through the cracks. The harder answer is that the cracks are the size of a man, and we have gotten very good at not looking. It is a medical bill that empties a life in a season. It is a claims backlog slower than a northern winter. It is a pension that stops stretching, and a warehouse that automates away 31 years, and the plain fact that an old man alone goes invisible to a busy world long before he ever needs to hide. By many accounts, tens of thousands of American veterans experience homelessness on any given night, and a great many of them you would never spot, because the ones who survive are the ones you cannot see. Sam knew others. You learned to spot them when you were one of them, the clean, invisible ones, the old men who are always just passing through. The veteran at the library who is there every day at opening. The fellow at the diner who nurses one coffee for 3 hours and tips too well for a man with nothing. They nod at each other sometimes, the invisible ones, a small recognition that costs nothing and gives everything, and then they go back to the work of not being seen. There is an entire hidden country of them out there, warm and unnoticed behind ordinary doors and ordinary glass, and you have walked past 100 of them on a street you called empty. Sam Rourke kept that unit. He is still there, or someone exactly like him is, behind an identical door in a building near you, warm and unseen with everything he has left. Once a year, on the 23rd of October, he takes the flag down off the wall and holds it for a while, and says the 8 names out loud in a warm, quiet room, which is more than the country that sent them has managed to do. He does it alone, because there is no one left to do it with, and that is its own kind of wound. 40 years is a long time to stand a watch that nobody else remembers is being kept. There were nights, warm and safe behind the boxes, when the hardest thing was not the cold or the hiding or the fear of the knock at the door. It was the plain arithmetic of being the last one. 8 men in the room and not one of them able to answer him. A whole country a few feet away through a steel wall and not a soul in it knowing his name. But he never once considered stopping, because a man does not abandon his post just because the post got lonely. He had learned that at 19, and he had never unlearned it. And it was, in the end, the very thing that kept both him and them alive. Here is what I keep coming back to. We taught that man to disappear so his enemies could not find him. We never once imagined the day would come when the people he most needed to hide from and to protect his brothers from were us. If you have ever had to go invisible to protect what mattered, or you know a veteran who did, tell me in the comments what it was you were keeping safe. Not for pity, because someone is watching this tonight, hidden on the edge of a cold city of their own, who needs to know they are not the only one who ever figured out how to survive without being seen. Next time, I will tell you about a homeless Green Beret who turned an abandoned railroad tunnel, sealed off and forgotten by the city decades ago, into a warm and hidden home, in a place the maps had already given up on. Because some of the men and women this country trained to survive anything were left, in the end, to prove it completely alone. And the country that taught them never once looked back to see if they had.